Jackson Brodie was a rising fourth-year medical student at the University of Pennsylvania when he decided to take a semester off and travel southern Europe. According to his mother, Brodie was suffering from nervous exhaustion and the persistent delusion of being haunted by the wraith, or spirit, of an old female cadaver he had dissected. Fearing an imminent breakdown, he hoped sometime during the Mediterranean would lift his spirits, so to speak. Letters and postcards sent home to his mother seemed to suggest his condition was greatly improving when he decided to extend his stay by 2 weeks and see some of northern Africa. He left Spain by boat in the fall of 1921, stopped in Gibraltar for a night, and then went on to Tangiers. Unfortunately, his last letter home displayed a steep regression into madness. He claimed the wraith had followed him to Tangiers and was stalking him through the dark winding streets of that ancient city. He included this one blurry photo as proof. Exactly what befell Brodie remains unknown, as all contact subsequently ceased and his body was never recovered.
Ernst and Rachel Tappig later admitted they were necking when their daughters Lily and Hilda wandered away from the picnic blanket they had spontaneously laid down near an old estate outside Hornbad Mainburg, in the Tudoberg forest. Exactly how long it took the Tappigs to realize their girls were gone remains in dispute, but this much is certain: they were wearing white jumpers over black turtlenecks when they disappeared, they were virtually inseparable, and their bodies were never found despite extensive searches. Lily and Hilda's case briefly became news again in 1957, 5 years after they went missing, when this photo came to light. It was taken by a Belgian naturalist named Frans Orlin, who claims he saw nothing moving through the forest that day.
Tim Stewart had only been working at the Cumberland County Archives for a little over 2 months when he took this photo, which allegedly captures the ghost of Ida Clark, an undersized, misshapen child who was taken down there and raped and murdered by her custodian uncle in 1953. In the afterlife, Ida evidently enjoys displacing objects and whispering in the ears of anyone caught alone in the archives. Turnover of the staff there had always been abnormally high, but rumors of this photo have made it almost impossible to keep employees for very long.
17-year-old Akiko Nakamura had been missing for nearly 2 months when her mother Masami finally gave up hope on the Tokyo police and turned to Daisuke Izakiya, one of Japan's last remaining practitioners of Nensha, or projected thermography. Izakiya also claimed to be a remote viewer, capable of finding missing persons with his mind, and would combine these talents to project what he saw onto Polaroids that, theoretically, would help locate them. Despite numerous attempts, this ghastly image was his only successful result. According to Izakiya, the shining object is a mirror, used to deflect psychic intrusions, and the reason his further attempts failed. According to Masami, the thing holding it is an Akuma, or demon. When asked later whether the image had helped her locate her daughter, Masami was curt and blunt. "Yes," she said, "my daughter is in hell."
Michael Evans was 15 and friendless in 1969 when he began wandering around town and taking photos of the abandoned houses and factories that were already beginning to swallow Detroit. He was fascinated by the swiftness with which nature could reclaim a man-made space and especially liked to capture vines growing up walls. The images preceding this one on the roll suggest that is exactly what he was doing that fateful Saturday in April before something caught his eye in the window above and he raised the lens to photograph it. How he ended up inside the house, what caused him to leave his camera behind, or why he didn't simply run away are questions that may never be answered.
This is the last known photo taken inside the Lakeview School in Collinwood, Ohio before it was consumed by fire on March 4, 1908, killing 172 students, 2 teachers, and 1 rescuer. The fire started when a ceiling joist ignited from a nearby steam pipe. Flames blocked escape routes, leading to panic and a stampede that trapped a large number of victims in a stairwell, where they were cooked alive. Additional casualties were incurred when burning students jumped from second- and third-story windows. Everyone in this photo perished, except for Mr. Olson, seated at the far right in the back row. The spectral artifacts in the photo remained unexplained.
When Francis Dodson turned 7 in 1960, his parents gave him a relatively inexpensive 35mm camera. The following summer, the 3 of them toured Iowa and Nebraska in a Chevy Apache pickup truck outfitted with an Alaskan camper shell. Fran liked to stay in the camper while his parents drove and take roll after roll of random shots out the back as they rode down the road. He took this one somewhere outside Dubuque. When the roll was developed and his parents saw the photo, they asked Fran what he had seen. He allegedly replied, "A dead black man, holding a white man's head by the hair." Who or what the photo actually depicts has never been conclusively determined.
This prophetically torn photograph depicts a regimental color guard of the Union Army, 1 month before they marched into battle at Antietam, September 1862. The gentleman on the far right, named John Ulsted, had the right side his face and right arm blown off by cannon fire at the start of those hostilities. It is unknown exactly when the damage to the photo occurred.
During her later years, Josephine Yurno would take a walk every evening at dusk around her beloved neighborhood in Norwich, Connecticut. On November 12, 1935, she set out as usual and never returned. Extensive searches were conducted by a large team of volunteers and the Norwich police force, but no sign of her was ever found. 3 years later, Mrs. Yurno was found in front of a neighbor's house, without a mark on her body and in perfect health. When asked where she had been, Mrs. Yurno was unable to understand the question. From her point of view, no time had passed at all. Against the advice of her neighbors and her doctor, she refused all medical treatment and resumed her life as if nothing had ever happened, including the nightly walks. Another neighbor snapped this shot of her in the fall of 1938. Clouds of smoke from piles of burning leaves give it an appropriately eerie feel. On the same date in November 1940, 5 years after her initial disappearance, Mrs. Yurno vanished again. This time she was never seen again.
The 1912 threshing of little Sally York, aged 9, in the cotton loom of the North Fork Textile Mill was one of a handful of such accidents that helped legislators push through the Keating-Owning Act of 1916, the first child labor law in American history. From the time of the accident until the mill's closing 4 decades later, workers consistently complained of cold spots, strange noises, and sudden taps on the shoulder when nobody was near. The mill's foreman never paid these complaints any mind until this photograph surfaced in 1932. It was taken by a traveling photographer named Benny Johnson, who promptly sold it to the North Fork Gazette for an unprecedented $10. The mill had shut down for the Christmas holidays and was empty at the time. The photo was later blamed for the closing of the mill, though the Great Depression was the more likely cause of that.
Danvers State Hospital, formerly Danvers State Lunatic Asylum, was a Kirkbride-style psychiatric hospital built in 1874 on what was then an isolated site in rural Massachusetts. Like all Kirkbridge asylums, it was famous for its Gothic architecture and its use of now outdated medical techniques to treat insanity. Danvers is often cited as the birthplace of the prefrontal lobotomy. Danvers has several other claims to fame. It was the inspiration for the fictional Arkham Sanatorium that appeared in several stories by H.P. Lovecraft and which, in turn, inspired the Arkham Asylum in the fictional Batman universe. It was also where the cult horror film Session 9 was filmed. That film put the vast network of tunnels beneath Danvers to good cinematic effect. It's no accident the filmmakers chose to use the tunnels, as rumors of their haunting had dogged Danvers for over 100 years. The most famous story concerns Sarah Eustace, a patient who escaped her ward in 1955 and snuck into the tunnel system. Despite multiple searches, and a week-long lockdown of the asylum, Sarah was never seen again. It was assumed she died down there, lost, thirsty, and alone. A nurse at Danvers named Gail Malloy became obsessed with Sarah's story and spent many of her off hours searching the tunnels for her remains. Though she never found a body, she did snap this photo in late 1966, which suggests Sarah Eustace walks the Danvers tunnels to this very day.
One would think that if ghosts exist, and linger in the places where their bodies lie, getting a photo of one in a graveyard should be a relatively easy undertaking, but this shot is the one of the few examples that has not been explained or debunked. It was taken by Ellery Reese while visiting her father's grave in Arlington Cemetery in March of 1949. If Mrs. Reese was trying to perpetuate a hoax, it was a strangely subtle one, because she never showed the photograph to anyone. In fact, she never had the chance. Her son Paul found the roll of film it was on in a bedside table while clearing the house after her death.
As far back as anyone living could remember, there had always been a legend of something not quite human living in the old abandoned house at the tail end of Sulphur Fork Trail, near Wildersville, Tennessee, where the road forks and peters off into dirt and brambles. It was a typical tall tale, used to scare children, and few adults paid the legend any mind until this one blurry photo surfaced in the early 40s and forced the sheriff to level and burn the building to keep the peace. The whole episode has more than a shake of Brothers Grimm in it. Marla Jenkins, the teenage girl who took it, was evidently an odd thing, prone to telling elaborate lies, and there are many who think the photo was a hoax, but if so, Marla was hoaxing herself as well. She bought the burnt land on which that old house had stood with a small inheritance from her grandfather, built herself a ramshackle cabin, and lived there for the rest of her life. In time, a new legend arose around the strange old lady in the woods and the creature she liked to ride naked in the moonlight.
1938, Evergreen Park, Illinois, outside Chicago. Billy and Stevie Harlow were riding in the front seat with their mother Tammy when their Ford sedan collided head-on with a Chrysler. During the collision, the cars spun in such as a way as to impact two additional vehicles. Tammy Harlow survived, but the boys were ejected through the windshield and killed instantly. A crime scene photographer from the local paper took this shot as a crew of volunteers worked frantically to free John Downing, the driver of the Chrysler. It appears that little Billy and Stevie stuck around to watch.
In life, Reverend Allen Yarborough was a respected minister in the small village of Wickford, Rhode Island. In death, he became a regular spirit visitor to the seances held by Anne-Marie Cotillionneau, a local medium. During his manifestations, Yarborough, speaking through Cotillionneau, would often make cryptic references to a series of secret crimes that he had committed, for which he was never fingered or punished. Concrete details were sketchy and hard to verify, but the things he said were horrifying and seemed to involve the ritual dismemberment of several unnamed local children whom Yarborough had evidently abducted and kept imprisoned in a forgotten sub-basement of St. Paul's Episcopal. The photo seen here was the result of an experiment conducted during one of the last of these manifestations. Cody Yard invoked Yarborough, as usual, and then at a pre-arranged signal two attendees tied back the curtains so that a third could take a photo in natural lighting. Opinions differ on whether the distorted visage reflects the torture of the damned or the ecstasy of bloodletting.
In northwestern Turkey lies a notoriously isolated and atmospheric region known as the Phrygian Highlands. Ancient rock-cut tombs and relatively modern graveyards sit side by side, essentially making the area one huge necropolis. When traveling through this haunted landscape, it is fairly common to experience something strange, but rarely as strange as what Frida Palermo encountered on September 5, 1956. Palermo was an Italian archaeologist specializing in Byzantine funerary sculpture. She was walking alone, photographing an unpublished cemetery near Ayazin, when the air seemed to change and grow heavy, as if to portend a storm. She later described hearing a sound like wind across the mouths of 1,000 bottles, and then something became momentarily visible on the outcrop high above her, just long enough for her to grab this shot of what she subsequently dubbed the Phrygian Djinn.
This photo of a typical turn-of-the-century London tenement was taken by an amateur photographer named Michael Oliphant, using a box camera in 1911. He was drawn to this particular set of flats by persistent rumors that the building was haunted by a tall, sallow man, who had a terrible habit of leaning over and staring at tenants while they slept, only to scare the living daylights out of them when they awoke. Oliphant himself saw nothing on that day, but he later recalled inexplicably losing his balance while taking the shot, as if someone or something had collided with him while rushing past.
The Sorensons were a Danish family who immigrated to the United States sometime between 1905 and 1906. They arrived with their eldest child, Anders, seen on the donkey, and settled on a farmstead in Missouri. 3 more children, Simone, Frick, and Mathilde, center, right, and in the wagon, respectively, soon followed. This photo, taken in 1916, captures all 4 of the children a few weeks before the tragedy. The 3 eldest kids were apparently playing fort in the hay barn and must have fallen asleep. Their father, Niklaus, drove a wooden hay sweep into the pile and dismembered all three, in locations accurately suggested by the flaw in the photo. Mathilde, the youngest, was inside the house with her mother at the time and not hurt. According to the son of a neighbor later interviewed by the author, the donkey later died in equally hideous fashion by getting its head caught in a barbed wire fence and nearly decapitating itself in the frenzy to get free. This final detail could not be corroborated.
Viola Peters was a well-born spinster who lived alone in the small rural town of McCaseville, Georgia. She was much loved in her community for her charitable contributions to the Baptist church, the soup kitchen, and the local orphanage, especially during the Depression, when those institutions subsisted almost entirely on her largesse. In July of 1935, Viola was brutally raped and murdered by a drifter named Tom Cullen, who had worked briefly at the nearby copper refinery. Cullen proceeded to stay on in Viola's house and savage her corpse for an additional 17 days before he was caught and captured. A posse of enraged locals stormed the county jail, took Cullen, and lynched him from the old bridge over the Toccoa River. This photo was taken by Garrett Killian, a witness to the lynching, and caused quite a stir when it was published a few days later in the Atlanta Constitution. To most, it suggested that Viola's spirit achieved some measure of peace by attending her killer's execution, but some twisted minds saw in her forlorn countenance a longing to get one last look at her one and only lover.
Dozens of documented massacres occurred during what later became known as the American Indian Wars, and most of those infamous sites now bear historical markers and official apologies from Uncle Sam. How many more remain undocumented and only recorded in the annals of the dead is unknown and will likely remain so. Unless, of course, more photographs surface like this one taken by Graham Wheeling in 1971 on BLM land near Kanab, Utah. Wheeling was camped out in a dry riverbed, pulling what he liked to call a cowboy weekend when he noticed that a carpet of fog was rolling in. As fog is extremely rare in that water-challenged region, he figured he should try to photograph it. He set up his tripod and took a 2-minute exposure in low light. Only later, in the dark room, did he learn what he was really looking at. Who says ghosts don't have a sense of humor? The Stevensons were a wealthy Boston family, proud of the industry and longevity with which most the clan was blessed. This portrait, taken in 1945, was an effort to gather the oldest Stevensons together with one of the youngest. Amelia, center, aged 102, was granted the honor of matriarch, while little Ophelia was the token child at 18 months. What the Stevensons did not realize until this photo was developed was that they had been joined that day by one of their deceased. James Pullman Stevenson, 1835 to 1932, seated at left between his niece Ginny and his cousin Alfred, was easily identified by several of those present, and remembered fondly as a rascally uncle known for pranks and dirty jokes.
In the era before abortion was legalized in the United States, short of a straightened coat hanger, the only option for a woman who wanted to terminate a pregnancy was to locate a doctor willing to do the job on the sly. Some of those doctors were good men, and some were not. At least one was a psychotic sadist. We know this because Tilly Jane Pridduck told her best friend Alice where she was going and why on the night before her shackled, mutilated body was found in a Philadelphia basement. We also know this because the fetus, her ovaries, most of her large intestine, and the tips of both her breasts had been removed and left on the floor beneath her. The amount of blood at the scene, coupled with deep, clawing gouges in the brick walls, led the attending medical examiner to conclude these atrocities had been committed while Tilly Jane was still alive and conscious. 10 years later, in 1941, a group of feminist mediums held a séance in the basement in an attempt to summon Tilly Jane and learn the killer's identity. The latter goal was not achieved, but the former was, as this photo taken by one of the attendees makes disturbingly clear. This is one of several famous photographs taken of the first ever nuclear detonation. Conducted by the U.S. Army on July 16, 1945, in the White Sands Proving Ground, located in the Jornada del Muerto Desert, about 35 miles southeast of Socorro, New Mexico. The setting off of this implosion-designed plutonium device, the same method used in the Fat Man device dropped on Nagasaki, ushered in the atomic age and the eventual arms race between the United States and Russia. Only a handful of people were aware that this photo was cropped before it was ever released to the public, and they are all now dead. One of them was the original photographer, who gave the author a copy of the original on the condition that it be kept out of the public eye until such a time that the citizens of the world could handle the ramifications of what it depicts.
For years, guests staying in this room at the old Riverside Inn in Jenner, California had complained of feeling watched through the window, but it wasn't until 1964, when a San Francisco travel writer named Michael Irwin thought to set up a timed exposure, that evidence of actual voyeurs was brought to light. Irwin lay on the mostly obscured bed in the foreground and read a book while his camera took a series of long exposures. When he showed this photo to the hotel owner, he was promptly asked to leave. 2 days later, the owner was dead by his own hand, and Irwin was left with a creepy picture and an unsolved mystery. The identities of the children remain unknown.
Unfortunately, almost nothing is known about this image: who took it, when, what it depicts, why it is so overexposed. In early 1968, several months after the Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, a vintage silver print of it was mailed, without return address and in a plain yellow envelope with a heavyweight clasp, to the Special Collections Division of the New York Public Library. Experts there could find no evidence of doctoring, and thought the image itself was quite old, possibly from the 19th century. It remained there, uncatalogued, until the library sold off a small portion of its undesired holdings in the early 70s. From there it passed through several hands until joining the present collection.
Drag marks in the leaves and mud led Ohio hunter Earl Guthrie to this bizarre scene in 1959. He found a young, still unidentified female victim dead, pale, and withered, as if, in his own words, something had drank her dry. Her arms were embedded deeply into the soft earth beneath her and pinned back at an extreme angle. Her face was turned away and contorted, as if in pain or terror. Arriving first, a local photographer aiding the police took one quick shot before an overwhelming sense of dread drove him back to the gravel road where he had parked. State police arrived several minutes later, but when they returned to the scene, the body was gone. Pareidolia is certainly in play, but one can't help but see in the bushes behind this poor woman some demonic mirror of whatever it was that took her.